On time, everyone. Good morning. My name is Adrian Hall. We're going to be delving into Azure App Service today. When we normally do a session on App Service, it tends to be very, very developer focused. And we do have some developer things in here, but the majority of the time we're talking about how you actually take an app service on Azure to production and all the things that you need to be aware of when you do that. An IT view of app service is fairly different from the developers. The developers, literally in their Visual Studio, they just right-click, publish, select app service, and they're done. It's a wonderful world the developer lives in. They don't have to deal with all of the complexities of a production environment. So we'll start off with a quick level set of Azure App Service. And then we're going to go through the 4 or 5 things that IT professionals deal with when we're taking a look at production services. We're going to take a quick look at ARM, Azure Resource Manager. We're going to look at doing continuous deployment, some of the slot facilities and some of the other facilities that we have for controlling going to production. And we're going to take a quick look at mobile authentication with Azure AD and how easy that is to set up. I'm quite open for questions at the end. I've got 2 bright lights right in my face, so if we can leave the questions to the end, that would be great. This is me. I run the Azure Mobile program, so that's Azure Mobile Apps and on App Service, and also Azure Mobile Services, which is the deprecated old mobile service program. I pretty much know mobile and web dev. And I have a blog, and we'll get onto some of the other things later. So what are mobile apps? This was designated a 200-level course, so for those that don't know what that means, it's a kind of one step up from the really beginner, what is it, and one step down from discussing architecture. It's kind of in that middle intermediary area. The application platform, the app service, sits in something we call platform as a service. So we abstract away a lot of the management tasks for you, leaving your developers to concentrate on code, but we still give you a very, very flexible service. So we're right at the top of the stack when it comes to the Azure resources. Mobile apps itself is a set of SDKs that live on top of that. It comprises of a server SDK and a client SDK. The client SDK will be used by your mobile client developers to communicate with the backend. The backend is built as a standard ASP.NET or Node application, so it's a standard web application, and it's just got some separate SDKs in there for things like user authentication, data connectivity, and push notifications. All of that runs on our excellent app service backend that gives you a whole bunch of stuff that we'll go through today. So I'm just this is very demo heavy, by the way, so I hope you like the demos. Creating a app service in the portal is relatively easy. I've taken the liberty of producing a resource group and a database because those actually take some amount of time to produce. And to create an app service, I'm just going to click on Add. And I'm going to search everything for mobile apps. And it will give me the several versions, but this is the one that's the central one. And I can just click on Create. And I'm going to give it a very simple name, BRK2251, which is us. I'm going to use it as the thing. And then we'll talk about app service plans in a moment as it's deploying. But I need to create an app service plan for it. And that tells me where it's going to go. So we are in East US right now, and a standard tier is great. And I'm going to pin that to the dashboard and click on Create. Now, app service plan is a central thing of the app service. There are 2 parts when you deploy a web app. One is the actual web app, and the other one is the app service plan. The app service plan is the set of VMs that your web apps are running on. So you can produce a scale set from that. You can automatically scale that app service plan. So, and there are different pricing tiers. Now, the pricing tiers are a combination of the size of the VM that you are running on and the features that are available to the web apps that are being published. So we have basic, standard, and premium. Those are the ones that we recommend for regular web apps. If you don't feel that you're going to be scaling, you will want to use a basic. If you want to scale, you're going to need to use a standard. If you need a very high scaling point, so think 20, 30 VMs, then you're going to want to go into the premium level. And then the 1, 2, and 3, you saw that the plan I chose was an S1. That's the standard feature set with the smallest size of VM. The 1, 2, and 3 give you consecutively bigger VMs. All the web apps that are associated with an app service plan run on all the VMs that are in that scale set. So I've created my web app now. And the first thing I want to do is I'm using a data-driven web application. So I want to go down to the data connections, and I want to link my SQL server. Now, there are two ways of doing this. Number one is to work out what the connection string that is needed for that SQL server is, which is a big, long thing that is prone to error. The other way is to use data connections, where I can actually just click through the data connections, and it will actually tell me, there is my database, and then I just need to put in the password, username and password, and it will actually tell me, hopefully, come on, that it's going to be right. I hope it's going to tell me anyway. Nope. Yeah. Let's try that one. And I can click on OK here, and it will actually set it for me. Huh. It doesn't like my password for some reason. I will work that out a little later. So the data connection will then appear there, and the connection string is created for you. I'm sorry, I don't remember the password now. At least I thought I did. So that's creating the mobile app. The other thing I can do is if I'm deploying a mobile app for the first time, I can actually use a quick start to get the mobile app with some content on it. And that's available through the quick start. So this is how developers would normally do things. Here's the thing, though. I'm an IT guy. I started my career as an IT guy. I don't like point-and-click GUIs for creating things. I like things to be repeatable. I like things on the command line. And I like to be able to check that configuration in as code because I'm part of a DevOps organization generally. So it's great, but fortunately, repeatable deployments on Azure are really easy. We have this thing called the Azure Resource Manager, and that will actually allow us to create JSON files that can be used for deployment. We can check in JSON files, they're just text, and that allows us to do repeatable deployments. There are two methods, depending on whether you have Visual Studio installed or not. If you have Visual Studio installed, you can use the new Azure Resource Group to project template to create one of these. If you don't, any old text editor will do. They're just JSON files, and we have a whole bunch of quick starts out on GitHub for many of the different project types. Now, an ARM template is just JSON. It has 3 sections. Parameters are the things that you want the user who is deploying to enter. Things like passwords are a good combination here. If you're doing differentiated services in different regions, you might want to select the region and the plan. But those are kind of things that are in parameters. Variables are calculated values. So a lot of people put things like a base name in the parameters and then calculate all the resource names according to their resource naming scheme in the variables. And then resources is a list of resources. So in general, you're going to have a resource group, you're going to have a SQL server, a database on that SQL server, a website, and an app service plan. And they're going to be linked together. So we can do all that in turn. Parameters are fairly simple. You give them a name and you give them a type, and if you want to, you give them some metadata that says what will get printed up when the user is asked for them, and then you can use them in the variables as well. There are some special ones. The hosting plan is a particular one. You need to be able to provide not just a hosting plan name like S1, but you need to be able to define the tier and the capacity as well. So we can define objects like this as well. Variables, we can take the parameters and we can put them in variables just by concatenating and doing certain operations. There's a big long list of operations that you can do in these variables, but these become just injectable variables into your ARM template. And finally, the resources, these are really complicated. They've got no rhyme or reason to the formula. They all have an API version. The API version is a magic string that says what you're going to, the version that of the ARM template that you're going to use for this resource. They've got a name, they've got a location, and they've got generally some SKU or properties associated with them. But the actual list of properties that they have tends to be open-ended and named weird. I will come along to how to get those properties in a moment. Going along with that, so we've got the ARM template, and it's really, I'm automating this. So I want those parameters. I don't want to type those parameters in. I want to actually define those as well. I want a production setup, a staging setup, and so on. So you can create a parameters file, which is also a JSON file, and it has the list of parameters with their values. And we'll show a password example of that later. In terms of deploying it, you've got 3 options. Again, if you're operating in Visual Studio and you've just written this and you just want to try it out, you can just right-click, deploy. In PowerShell, you log in, which is login Azure RM resource, and it will pop up a little dialog to let you log in, and then you're logged in, you run the deploy Azure resource group, the script that is contained within the project. And finally, the Azure CLI, you have to install the Azure CLI. It's a node package. So it's standard npm install, and then you can run Azure Group Create. And again, there's a login process and so on. So let's take a quick look at that. So I have here my Visual Studio. So let's start with the Visual Studio one, and I'm going to click on New Project. Initializing templates, wonderful. And in the cloud section, so templates, Visual C#, cloud, there is an Azure resource group. And I'm just going to call it Azure Resource Group 1, that's fine. I can put this into a Git repository if you want to check it in. I can check it into Visual Studio Team Services. I tend to create an additional project alongside all of the other things. So my developers have their back-end code. I have a deployment project right alongside that. And I'm going to click on OK, and it's going to initialize the template. The next thing is what sort of template do you want? I've got a web app plus SQL down here, right here, but you can see that there's an awful lot of other things depending on what you want to do. These are just starting points. You can add your own resources, you can change the parameters around, and so on. You can also see that there's some quick starts, again, from that Azure Quick Start templates. You can get them from here as well. And I'm going to click on OK to create the files. So there is my deploy Azure resource group PS1, right, in the first piece. There is the website SQL database.json is the ARM template. And I've got a .parameters.json there as well. And if I just double click into that, you can see that it's fairly long, but the actual capabilities are fairly long. So that you've got the resources, you've got the variables, and you've got the parameters. And then in the database.json, you've got the parameter, all the parameters are defined again, but for a piece. Now, if I want to deploy this, I'm just going to right-click on the project, and I'm going to select Deploy, New. It's going to require me to log in, maybe. Come on. Spinny time. I'm going to create a new resource group called BRK2251 VS. And I'm going to put that in East US. Click on Create. And click on OK. And it's going to prompt me for the values. So yeah, man. Put some standard values in. And you'll see anything that I'm typing BRK2251, that's just a parameter that you choose. There's nothing special about it. I do need an admin login, so I'll say Azure. And I'm going to put in my standard password, database name. There we go, that works. And click as save, and it's going to go up and do its thing. Now, the one thing you'll notice straight away is that deploying via an ARM template is faster than deploying via the portal. Doing well here. There we go. It will actually deploy much faster. It's inevitably, when I do a deployment via the portal, it's going to take somewhere between 3 and 5 minutes. When I do a deployment through Visual Studio, PowerShell, or the Azure CLI, it will take about 60 seconds. And you can see all the, within 15 seconds, it's actually created all of the resources. So there we go, deployed. 15 seconds. So this is a much faster way of deploying as well. Once you've got these, you can give them to your developers, and you can say, just run this to create your plan. It'll be 15 seconds, and it's done. It's much faster. And you get a consistent developer view. The developers are using exactly the same deployment that you're using in production. If I switch over to PowerShell, when I created that resource group in Visual Studio, it gave me an Azure Resource Group 1 directory in this projects folder, and another one. And you can see that I've got this PS1. So the first thing I need to do is log in Azure RM account. And that's going to pop up. Now, Visual Studio, PowerShell, and the Azure CLI have completely different login mechanisms, store the tokens in different ways. So just because you're logged in on one does not mean to say you are logged on the others. So I'm just going to log in here. There we go. It's thinking about it. There we go. And now I can do deploy Azure Resource Group.ps1, and it will actually ask me for all the things. So the resource list, East US, administrator password, and it's going to go through exactly the same process. Now you notice this yellow is exactly the same output that we had in the Visual Studio output, so it's exactly the same. Done, 10 seconds. So that's the PowerShell version. The CLI version, I always have to look up. I'm very used to PowerShell. I'm very used to Visual Studio, but I always have to look up the Azure version, the CLI version. So the first thing is Azure login. I've already done the npm install of the Azure CLI here. And it says, open up a web browser and use this code. So here's my web browser. I'm going to go aka.ms/device login. And it's going to say, what's the code? The code is over here. I'll get that, and it's cut and paste. And I'm going to click on continue. I'm going to log in as me. And I've signed in. And if I go back to here, it's going to work. It's going to notice that I've signed in, and I'm now set up. So the next thing I want to do is do an Azure config mode ARM. There are two configuration modes, and the Azure CLI supports both. One is Azure Resource Manager. The other one is classic mode. They correspond to the new portal versus the old portal. Okay, so I want to make sure that I'm in that one. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a resource group, which is Azure Group Create. I'm going to give it a name, and I'm going to give it a location. Okay, and that's going to create a environment for me. So the next one is to actually use that ARM template to actually deploy something. So I'm going to go Azure Group Create. And these, by the way, magic strings. It's look them up, and the deployment guide does actually give you these statements. But the first one is the templates. And just make sure that I'm in the right place. Yep. So Azure Group Create. The -f is for the template. So there's website SQL database.json. Then I'm going to need the -e and the actual parameters file. So that's websites.parameters.json. And then arm2 and the location. And it's going to fail. Because this is one of the differences, this is why I don't like using the Azure CLI so much, is it does not ask you for anything. You noticed it even made you go somewhere else to log in. So what you have to do is you actually have to edit the parameters file in order to make sure that all the parameters are there. And it actually tells you, for example, the value for the template parameter administrator login password is not provided. So what I can do is I can just take a look at this. This is Visual Studio Code, just to kind of prove that I don't need Visual Studio. And there is no administrator login password, so I'm going to login password, enter it. Can't type today. I hope that's a strong password. I hope that's what they meant when they said strong password. Anyway, and I've saved that. So this is literally a list of all the parameters that I'm expecting from the parameters section of the template with their values. If I just, yep, that one, that should now work. And again, fairly quick. So if we go back to our portal, which is right here, and I go to the resource groups, you can see there's ARM2, which was from the Azure CLI, and it has created a whole bunch of stuff for me. There is Azure Resource Group 1, and it's created a whole bunch of stuff for me. And I'm pretty sure there was a BRK2251 VS, and that created a whole bunch of stuff for me. So all of this has been created for me. And you notice the template, I actually used unique IDs so that I can, particularly useful for developers to say, when you do this, you're going to get a unique host name. I'm going to generate one for you. You can just go and use it. So you get these slides if you go onto the MS Ignite site and you look at this session. You'll get the slides for this, but this is just a reminder of what you need to do. So moving on to the next section, continuous deployments. And this was one of the things that killed me when I was IT guy, was developers continually coming around and going like, hey, I need a deployment. I need to spin up a VM, and I need to deploy my code. And we didn't give them access to the production site. So the problem is the developers come around and say, hey, we need a deployment. I'm not responsible for testing. I'm responsible for the production environment. I need to make sure that is solid. I need to protect that backend service. I don't want to let the developers onto that production service. So how do I ease my time so that I'm not responding to every single deployment request, particularly when some DevOps groups do 8, 10, 15 deployments a day. I could be doing this all day, every day. So how do I do that? And the answer is, your developers are checking code in for this website into a source code control system. So why don't you just link that source code control system to the site? When they check into the source code control system, it automatically deploys for them. You don't get involved. The way you do this is, we've already created 4. We create the mobile site as normal. Create the app service as you would normally do. Use ARM, use PowerShell, use Visual Studio, whatever you want to do. There's a piece called deployment options. You can go into there and link that site to the SCC repository, and then use site deployment scripts, which can be created by the developers to do extra stuff during the deployment. So for example, if they've got a website and they have to generate JavaScript artifacts in order to support that website during the deployment process, you can add a step in the build process to do that. I don't recommend, though, linking the master branch of the source code control system directly to your production site. That is asking for trouble. What I tend to do is say 3 branches. Your master branch is where the developers are going to do all their work. They're going to fork off a branch, a feature branch, do some work, merge it back into master. At some point, I hope you all have a release manager. The release manager is going to say, this is a good enough point to break and do a release. He's going to stop check-ins on the master branch, and he's going to merge that master branch into a staging branch. Okay? Now, your staging branch is where he does his integration tests, all the testing locally. He's then going to say, this is good enough to publish. And he's going to merge that staging branch into a deployed to Azure branch. Azure is going to automatically pick up the changes to that deployed to Azure branch and publish it. I'll do a quick demo of how we do this on my main site, since I did such a wonderful job of doing the demo earlier. So the new menu system is fairly long, but fortunately they've got a search option. So you can just type in deploy, and there's deployment options. Now I happen to have a website in GitHub. So the first thing I'm going to do is choose GitHub. I've already logged in to GitHub before, so it's going to use the credentials that I've already provided. I get to choose a project. I've got a whole bunch of projects here, but here's the one for today, Ignite 2016 BRK 2251. And I get to choose a branch. So I've only got one branch, master. If I had multiple branches, I would pick the branch that was the deploy to Azure branch. So I'm just going to pick that, and I'm going to click on OK. As soon as it is has set up the deployment source, because this is the first deployment, it's going to automatically pull the resource and start deploying it. Let's try that. There we go. It went just as I clicked. So you'll see every single time someone does a merge into that deploy to Azure, you'll get an entry like this. Now, we keep a whole bunch of these around. Internally, there's a Git repository that keeps all the check-ins to the deployed system as well. So we're just linking those two Git repositories together. That means that you can step back to any previous deployment relatively easily just by clicking on it and saying deploy this version. So as you mount up the changes, you'll be able to see those. And this will actually deploy the latest version, and once it's done, it will be available. The only problem is, of course, linking that source code control system directly to your production site is probably not what you want to do, because you want to protect that production site from bad code at all costs. The other thing is that once you deploy, you're going to restart the site. And that restart means that you're going to go to a cold start. That means that you've got somewhere in the region 10, 15, upwards of 60 seconds of downtime every single time your developers decide to deploy. Now, last time I checked, most business managers don't like 20+ minutes of downtime a day. If you're in a DevOps environment and your developers are deploying 20 times a day, that's exactly what you're going to get. So it's a bad experience. So Azure App Service has a feature that we call slots. Basically, you've got your production slot that gets created for you. That's your production site. You've got another slot that is a website, a full website, and it's named, say, staging. If your production site is foo, then your staging site is foo-staging. It's as simple as that. And what we do is we deploy to that staging site instead. Now we can do a whole bunch of integration tests against that staging site. We can warm it up, in effect. We can do requests against it. And part of the deployment actually does that for you. When it is warmed up, you can actually say, I'm good now. I've done all my tests. I've done my integration tests. I've done my load test. I'm pretty sure that this is a good site. I'm now going to swap it into production. At that point, we do another warm-up, maybe to refresh the cache and so on with the production settings. And then we start redirecting traffic for the production site to that slot. Once that starts happening, the traffic from the original slot will start draining off. When it's empty, we'll shut down that slot and move it over. So you get a slot swap effect. So always link to the source code control system to a staging slot. I also like having 3 slots because I like to have a spare slot that says this is my last known good production slot. So if I need to, I can swap that slot that's got my last known good state back into production very quickly. So slot swapping. I'm going to actually disconnect this from here because this is my production slot. And I don't really like doing that, as I said. So I'm going to add a slot, and I'm going to call it staging, because it seems like a good source. And I can either clone the configuration or not. So I'm going to clone the configuration source from my production site. Seems like a good thing to do. There are reasons why you would not want to do that. The most basic reason is you want to use a test database instead of your regular database. If you want to do that, then you're going to want to actually have a slot setting. If you've ever done the, gone into the, I'm going to remove that, gone into the app settings, down here in the actual app settings, there's this thing that says, is it a slot setting or not? And what we do, if it's a slot setting, it's unique to this slot. It won't get copied over. And what you can do is you can go into the deployment slots, and you can select the staging site. And this staging site looks exactly like a regular site, mostly because it is. You can then go down into these application settings, and you can set something to be a slot setting, and let's say I wanted this to be node 6.4.0 instead. I can actually make that a slot setting, and then it will not be overwritten by the production site. So now I want to, my staging site is run, come on. I think it got confused. So I'll go back into my deployment slots. There we go. And I'm going to go into the deployment options, and I'm going to link this up to this, the staging site, just like I did before. Ooh, there we go. Ignite, master, OK, done. There we go. Hopefully it's hopefully it's deploying now. I'm hopeful. There we go. So that's now deploying to the staging site. Now, in terms of slot swapping, there's kind of a best practice, which is to have at least 3. I'm currently deploying to the staging site. I'm brand new web app. I've already got my production app. So the first swap I'm going to do is to put the staging site into production. That will create a new production and an old production. Now, that old production has been running for a while, probably. So I want to keep that around. So I also do a second swap with the last known good. So now, when I'm finished, my new production is in production. My old production is where my last known good is. And I've got a new staging site that's ready to be deployed next time I check something into the GitHub repository. If I find that my new production is actually bad code, even though it's past testing and stuff like that, things happen. And we've all had experiences, I'm sure, with that. I can always swap the old production into the new production site. So let me just go back to my, oops, that's still deploying heavily there. Oh no, there it goes. So what I can do now is I can go back to my deployment slots, and there is a swap button here. So this is, I'm going to swap production with staging. I'm not going to produce any warning, but you can preview the changes here, and I just click on OK, and it's going to start the swap. Now, what it's going to do is it's going to call the home page by default. So it's just going to do a HTTP request to /. You can also, in the web.config of your application, you can define additional URLs that the warm-up will hit. So people generally define a route called /warmup, for example, that this will hit on the first request to warm up the cache, do the connection to the SQL database, whatever you really want to do to make sure that your web application is ready for running. Once the warm-up returns, and all the warm-up URLs return, it's going to start accepting requests. Once all of the requests on the old site are drained, it's going to say, okay, that's now swapped out. So you'll have this, during the swap process, it will actually have traffic going to both. There is a concept in the app service plan called ARR affinity, and that basically makes sure, you'll see it in a cookie on the web browser, that makes sure that you're going to the same site, the same VM, so on, for each request. You can turn that on or off, depending on how stateful your web application is. If it's completely stateless, turn it off. You'll help your load balancing. If you do actually have a little bit of state, it's worthwhile turning it on. And the default is on, so you don't actually have to do anything there. So my site is now deployed, and I can go back and hit my /brk2251.azurewebsites.net. And hopefully it will show that I have that deployed site now. I'm sure I do, but more tools, developer tools. Yeah, it's in Azure Websites. Yep. Well, I have a site. I don't know why it didn't deploy. Oh, my database is broken. That's why. So that is slots. I'm going to take a small pause there. Just make sure everyone's keeping up. Anyone have any questions about deployment and slots and SCC? Yes?
For the slot values where you say that this setting is slot specific,
Mm-hmm.
do you mark that on both places, the parent?
No, it's an overwrite. So the question is the slot setting marked on both places, on the parent and the slot? It's only on that slot, and it's basically an overwrite. Yes? Do you have to rename all the slots after they have swapped? No, they gain the name of the original slot. So I had a BRK2251 slot, and I had a dash staging slot. After I swapped them, the old production is now called the staging slot, and the production is the parent slot. Complete swap. Yes, a complete swap. Yes?
So instead of we can use TFS, right?
Can you use TFS? There are complications with TFS. The general rule is that there are two ways of deploying. One is let app service do it for you, and that's generally a Git pull. So there's webhooks built into Git. There are other ways of doing it as well, Bitbucket, VSTS. If you're using TFS, you're generally going to be using something like a Jenkins build system or something similar to that, where you've actually got a build step as part of the process, and at the end of that build step, you're going to upload the code to the site. So TFS is a little bit different, but it does highlight the other way of deploying, which is to link up a build system, and at the end of the build system, you do a deployment. And the deployment credentials for that are set in the build process. So again, you don't have to be involved in that. And aside from that, I still recommend the same thing. In other words, you don't deploy that build step as it gets to the end of the deployment and it starts deploying to the Azure App Service. You still deploy to a staging site and do your tests in the cloud.
So about the deployment slots, are they actual websites or they're just configuration?
Are they actual websites or are they just configuration? They are actual websites. So I can go to BRK2251-staging. Now my slot was called staging, and I can actually go to that. And it's a real website. Now the interesting thing is there are a number of websites available on a plan. So for example, a standard plan will have 10 websites available to you. Each slot counts against that 10. Okay, so you're not paying any more for the slots because you're paying for the app service plan, not for the number of websites. But you're limited to 10 websites, and that means that, and each slot is a website, so you're going to be, that counts against that number. So if you have 2 websites with 3 slots, a production, a staging, and the last known good, that's 6 of your 10 websites.
So let's say I have like 2 dev and 2 QA and production and staging. Would I set up in one ARM with different slots or different ARM with different slots? Because my configuration will change for each one.
And the honest answer is it depends. So the question was, if I have 2 dev and 2 QA and a staging and a production, I'm assuming, would I set them up as different ARM templates, or would I use them? Would I set them up as separate sites? I would personally, I believe that using the same ARM template for dev, QA, staging, and production, and just parameterizing the things that change is the right way to go. So you would have a single ARM template for all of those environments, and then you would have a parameters file, one for dev, one for QA, one for staging, and one for production. And that would allow you to select the appropriate environment. The other thing I would say is your developers are likely to have an MSDN license as part of that's how they get with Visual Studio, for example. That MSDN license has Azure credits associated with it, okay? So you need to get your developers to sign up for Azure through those credits. Now they can do their testing and their deployments against their own subscription. They're not touching your production stuff, yeah? Your staging and your production environment on one subscription, your developers live on their own subscriptions.
One question, when I can jump in here.
Absolutely.
How scriptable is the swapping? I mean, you showed us.
Yeah, I showed you a click. There is actually there's an Azure, I believe it's Azure Site Swap minus source production minus destination staging, that sort of thing. I don't know the exact syntax, but Azure Site Slot Swap help will probably get you it. There's the same thing on PowerShell. It's set Azure. I'm gonna get this one. Set Azure RM Site Swap. I think it is. But again, PowerShell has great help. But there's a command to do it on the command line. You can also, by the way, go into the Cloud Explorer or the Server Explorer in Visual Studio, right-click and swap as well.
Shared across the app service plan, so I have a large maybe hit in staging while doing testing. Does that affect production?
Yes, it does. So when you are operating on an app service plan, all websites, and remember a slot is a website, all websites share the same set of VMs. So that means that every single website is available on every single VM. If you're doing, let's say, a load test as part of the deployment, which is an option available to you, then that load test is going to affect your production. So just like any other, if you go down and talk to the app service people down in the expo hall, what they will tell you is if you've got a particularly hot site out of your set of sites, you put that onto its own VMs, which is equivalent of putting it onto its own app service plan. Okay, the final bit is Azure AD. We heard some complaints that Azure AD and AD in general is slightly complicated. There are lots and lots and lots of options. And we wanted to make it easy. Here's the problem. If you've got a web app, you have an application defined in Azure AD for that application that says this application is allowed to authenticate users, and you set up an OAuth flow for that application. If you have a mobile app, you have a registration for the mobile app, and then you say in the web app, this mobile app is allowed to access this web app. So it's complicated. We try to make it easy, but I'm going to go through this rather complicated flow with you, just so you can see how to set it up. The reason why I'm putting it here is, you have to make sure that your developers are following best practices, that they are not just you can just use the web flow. You can pop up a little web view and go through the flow, and you get a token at the end, and you can use that in your mobile app. It's not recommended. Azure AD guys have produced a library called ADAL, the AD Access Library, you really need to use that to authenticate users in the mobile app. Use a secure token store. That token gives access to the mobile backend or the web backend. So you want to protect that. And the token is minted for 1 hour. Mobile devices, most people use multiple hours, so make sure that they're using refresh tokens and they're using the recommended pieces there. And as IT guys generally get roped into the security aspects of the deployment, and this is definitely one. All the IT guys I know don't let the developers touch the AD settings, so this is something that they're going to ask you to come and do. So let us go into we've been using this site, and there is a section on the options called authentication and authorization. Now, I'm going to assume that you have already linked your site, your Azure AD to your on-premise AD and gotten all the usernames and passwords in there, and it's all working, probably because you've already linked it for Office 365. If you've done that, you've done enough work to do this job. The first thing you're going to do is turn authentication on. Yay. There is a slightly odd question, and it's slightly counterintuitive. At least I find it so. Which is, when you get a request that is not authenticated, what do you want to do with it? Now, most people go, well, I want people to log in with Azure AD. It's generally not the right thing. You generally want to say, allow the request. And that's because the website has certain things, images, JavaScript libraries, stuff like that, that don't need to be authenticated. And the developer wants to make the decision themselves as to what is authenticated and what is not. The other thing that they want to do is they want to actually get the identity of the user that is connecting. If you say, authenticate everybody, the developer does not get that identity because the authentication has gone somewhere else and come back and he's just presented with a website. If you say allow request, you still get that same flow, but it's under the control of the developer, and the developer gets the identity at the end. Okay? So you definitely want to say allow request. We then have a number of providers. You can actually configure any provider. We really don't care. We have specific functionality for these 5 providers. If you are not in these 5 providers, then you are in the custom range. You get a lot of people that say, I want to store the username and password in a database. That's definitely in the custom range. You're going to have to do your own flow for that, but we can handle it. So I'm going to say, configure my Azure AD. Now, fortunately, we've thought about the common case. The common case is I'm building a web app or a mobile app or an API app, and I just want authentication. So I click on Express. I'm going to create an app. I get to name it. I'm going to create a new app, and I'm going to click on OK. That is the entirety of the configuration for the web app. There is nothing else to do. Done. So once that is done, I'm going to going to draw your attention to the token store. The token store is an area on the disk. Now, in the case of the app service, you've got a number of VMs that are utilizing a shared disk. And it's shared across all of them. That's how we ensure that the same deployment is going everywhere. There are obviously concerns with that, particularly if you are using stateful writes. But in the midst of all this disk, we have this token store. This prevents, if you've got ARR affinity turned off, you were hitting one VM and you authenticated to that. If you didn't have the token store turned on, the next time you would go to a different VM and you'd have to authenticate again because you didn't have a token for that VM. That VM didn't have the token in their store. So if you turn the token store off, that means that you're going to basically be authenticating for every single VM. Keep it turned on. It's the simple way. So I'm just going to save that, and that's going to configure Azure AD for me, set up the authentication the way I want it to, and you can test it by going to brk251. So this is my websites.net, and then going .auth/login/AAD. That is the entry point for the authentication flow. It's going to do exactly what you would think. I'm already logged in because I logged into the portal, and the website are using the same Azure AD. But if you were bring up a in private browsing session, you would go through the flow. So and you get a nice banner that says you've successfully signed in. Things are working. You'll notice that the authentication token is right on the URL there. There is also a cookie behind the scenes that contains the authentication token. That's a secure token, so you won't be able to see it normally. It will only get submitted to the website in question. So how do you do the mobile app part? Because this is the complicated part. The first thing you do is you go to the old portal. Now, Azure AD, I believe 2 weeks ago, released a preview of Azure AD in the new portal. There are certain things you can't do. So I'm going to go down to my all items, and I'm sure that my default directory is there. So here's my default directory. I'm going to click on Applications, and you can see my BRK2251 is right there. Okay, so I'm going to add a new application my organization is developing. I'm going to call it BRK2251-mobile, and it is a native client application. It is not a web application. Okay, my redirect URI is very important. It is your website .auth/login/done. Magic string time. It's always the same thing. It is documented, so you don't have to remember it, fortunately, but that's what it is. Click on the tick, and it will enable it for you. So we've got that. We've got the mobile. I'm now going to click on Configure. I'm going to scroll all the way down. And the thing I need to do is the permissions to other applications, I need to add an application. It's not a Microsoft app, it's all apps. And I'm going to go click because I don't have that many, so I don't need to search for it. But I'm going to click on the plus that was next to BRK2251. It turns into a green tick, which is, with this contrast, barely visible. And I'm going to click on the tick to complete. Then I need to give it a delegated permission. And I'm going to give the mobile app, permission to access the web app. And then I'm going to save. So that is how you set up the mobile app. Now, there's certain information on this page that your mobile client developer is going to need. They are going to need this redirect URL. They are going to need this client ID. They are also going to need the name of the domain, which is not always obvious. So to get the domain, this is my domain. It is always listed on the domains page, but they're going to need that as well. Once they have those three pieces of information, they can actually configure ADAL to produce the appropriate native login experience, and then when they initiate the connection to that mobile backend, it will be all authenticated for them. Now, this does have the advantage of if someone gets those credentials for the AD client credentials, you can actually turn that off without needing to affect the web app as well. So, where are we? Does that make sense to everyone, the Azure AD piece? We've made it as simple as we can. There are some tricky bits. Now, I also have a book and a series of blog posts that go into some of the other funky things, particularly refresh tokens that people need to deal with. So take a look at those. I've got links at the end. But best practices: create an ARM template. They're not hard. They look scary. Everyone goes, ARM templates. They're not really that scary. Do a learn one. I'll come back to one other thing I mentioned at the beginning I forgot to give you, which was how do I get those properties for the ARM template? We'll get onto that in a minute. Continuous deployment, it's a good thing. It will save you time. It will mean that your developers don't come to you for deployments. You can use a deployment script. There is a Azure site deployment script command. There is an equivalent in PowerShell as well that creates the deployment scripts, base deployment scripts for you, the default ones, and then you can modify them, and they're PowerShell scripts as well. Use slots, protect your production app, and the security aspects, 2 apps for mobile devices, and make sure your developers are following all the security best practices. I'm just going, before we finish, I'm going to go back to my system here, and here's my mobile site. If I type resource here, there's a resource explorer, and it opens up an additional window. Resources.azure.com. It uses your regular Azure credentials, so you can actually go just to resources.azure.com. This is a behind-the-scenes thing. You can easily break things here. So we've actually done some protections. So for example, you'll notice in the top right-hand corner, we are in read-only mode. In order to do things, we have to switch to read-write mode. There is a text box in the middle. If you want to edit it, you have to click on the edit button. So we try to do the appropriate things to make sure that you're not shooting yourself in the foot. But what you can see here is all of the properties. So here is a properties section. In actual fact, here is a resource, and you can actually see all the bits for it. So the name, the type, the kind, but here are the properties. And you can see you can set pretty much everything about this site for it. So this is one of the ways that you can set up something, and then you can go to the Resource Explorer and take a look at the properties and go, I want to set it up the same way. I'm going to cut and paste this property section into my template, ARM template. That, of course, will make the ARM template completely massive. That's OK. It's just code. You can check it in. You can edit it, and so on. But that allows you to really lock down the configuration of the resources that you are creating. And that goes for everything. I mean, you can see here is my one group, and I've got the providers. I've got the SQL server here. I've got the DB server. I've got pretty much everything in here. So there's a lot of good stuff in here that you can take a look at. So back to the slides. Some more resources for you. I said I was a developer nowadays. This is not a development course, but there are a lot of things in the book and in the 30 days of Azure Mobile that are useful, particularly around how to set up authentication and how to set up the websites for resiliency. So I've taken screenshots. I've really fleshed out that material, so definitely take a look at those. And then 2 links for you to get into the appropriate place to talk about deployment. The resource manager has all the information that I've just given. That's ARM deploy. And then Zumo.deploy gives you all the options for deploying code to an app service in the end. So I've got about 9 minutes left. Questions? Can you configure the Azure AD from an ARM template? I do not know. However, down in the Microsoft section of the expo hall at booth MS60, which is like towards the back, is where the Azure AD guys sit. They're kind of in the central part at the back of the Microsoft section. They would definitely be able to tell you that. Yes?
The mobile SD, I guess the Azure SDK for Visual Studio templates. What do you download on that page when you go to it? There's like tons of sections like Python, .NET.
So,
And then when I click on the download, it's like it asks me like 20 different downloads.
great question. What you need to do is in Visual Studio, go to Tools, Extensions and Updates. And in the online version, there is, if you search for Azure, it will get you the right thing. Where is it? Oh, because I've got it installed. Do I? Yes, I have it installed. I've already got it installed, so that's the problem. The Azure SDK is here. It's the first step, and there is one for Visual Studio 2015. So, but yeah, all the others are various SDKs to work with Azure, but that's the one that you want. Okay. So they asked me to ask you to evaluate me, invite me back. So there's the scan. Just go onto My Ignite and please do rate the session. I'll be around for another few minutes, but thank you very much for turning up.